Quran doesn't have that. I'll go down to this. I realize that it's actually better for me to go down to the point number 4, what stories do the non-Muslim sources really tell? Because if we look at, if we do say, you know, we don't trust Muslims, let's not listen to Muslims about their religion or their history. Let's only look at non-Muslims. If we actually look at what the full picture, the full image that these sources convey, what you see is something that's not that different from what Muslims think. And this, if I recommend a book by, I think he's a wonderful historian, Robert Hoyland, British, but I don't know where he works now, if he's in the UK or in Oxford. I've always wanted to meet him. It's a very, oh really? Oh, he's coming to the US too, to Georgetown to give a lecture. I'm very excited. I've really enjoyed his books over the years. In his book, Islam as Others, I think Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, or Seeing Islam as Others See It, I can't remember the exact title. But he's a discussion at the end, which is excellent. He says, let's actually look at what, just taken together, what do these sources say? You know, if you look at John of Finac and the Zucnin Chronicle and Sebeos and Doctrina Jacobi, you get this composite image that there was a person named Muhammad, that he was the Mahdaya, he was the guide, the Syriac word for the guide of the Muslims, that he preached the religion of Abraham, that he taught the Arabs about the one God, he forbade lying and eating carrion, that the Muslims took the sunnah of their prophet really seriously, the law of their prophet really seriously, and punished people who didn't obey it, that they built mosques, houses of worship that tried to face Mecca, that they saw themselves within the tradition of Moses, that this was all happening in the 630s. This is all, this is not that, I mean, you don't get the details. You don't get, you know, the prophet said this and the prophet said that, the details of hadith. But the general narrative seems to be confirmed. And there's nothing there that is unusual for a Muslim. And if there are things in these non-Muslim writings that differ with what Muslims say, or that seem to be denigrating, well, that's not surprising. Because one, some of these figures don't have a lot of information about Muslims. Two, they don't like Muslims. They are writing about the group that has taken over their lands and is a scourge of God, bringing a heretical religion. It's interesting, they don't complain. They talk about Muawiyah's rule as being a time of justice and prosperity. They say the Muslims, they don't really care about your religion as long as you pay your taxes. They don't really care what religion you follow. Interestingly, one of their criticisms, I think it's the John of Finac says this, one of his criticisms is that the Muslims don't persecute Jews enough. Said about this. Because the Byzantine emperor in 632 issued an edict that to forcibly convert all Jews of the Byzantine Empire to Christianity. Not a lot of people know this. He issued an edict to forcibly convert all the Jews of the Byzantine Empire to Christianity. Why didn't that get carried out? Because of the Muslim conquests. So there's a reason why in a lot of areas, especially Egypt, the population welcomed the Muslim invaders. Why did the Muslim conquerors set up capital in Fustat, which it's now Cairo? Why not Alexandria, which is the actual capital? Because they went in with, and the Byzantine emperor had appointed his own patriarch of Alexandria, not accepted the patriarch who represented the religious beliefs of the people in Egypt at the time. That patriarch was kind of an outlaw, and he basically was, the Muslims were going to install him as a patriarch. And their invasion and occupation, not of Alexandria, but of the area around Cairo, was done with the cooperation of the Christian leadership in that area. And one of the arguments for why they set up their camp there in Fustat was because they wanted to use the monasteries in that area to help them administer the region. Because Muslims, remember, they don't know how to do taxes or anything. They're Bedouins. They don't know how to deal with agricultural tax. So they needed the existing administrative elite of places like Syria and Central Asia and Egypt. So the argument being that really these non-Muslim sources don't tell a story that's dramatically different from the Muslim sources. What about arguments against Shaykh and Goldzahar and Yoinbol? We already mentioned the defenses put up by people like al-Azami, but other scholars built on that. Harold Motzky, for example, a German scholar who's now retired, he's not Muslim. He says very clearly, I'm not interested in defending hadiths. I'm not trying to defend the Islamic tradition against critics. But what I'm trying to do is to actually take the evidence seriously and not just judge it without real scholarly investigation. We may conclude that a certain hadith is made up or that a certain set of hadiths are forged. But we shouldn't conclude this without analyzing the evidence closely. And he introduces a method of analysis that he calls isnad cum metin analysis, isnad and metin analysis, which is based on a few assumptions. That the isnads that Muslims include in their books in some way represent real transmissions that occurred, in some way. That the contents of hadiths usually tend to be consistent along the lines of these transmissions. That a certain transmission will include certain detail on the metin, another one will include another detail. And he comes to these conclusions based on his own experience in reading. These are important assumptions of his analysis. And what he does is, if you take into consideration the actual breadth of the Islamic tradition, so instead of just using the 6 books, so Yoinbol basically used a book called Tuhfat al-Ashraf by Jamal ad-Din al-Mizzi, who died 742-1341, a colleague of al-Dhahabi and Ibn Taymiyyah in Damascus. It's essentially a map of the isnads in the 6 books and a few other small collections. And he uses this to construct the isnad trees that he analyzes. And he might add a few other books like the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. But this is a tiny fragment of all the material, even from that early period. The Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani, the Musannaf of Abu Bakr ibn Abi Shayba, the Jami' of Ibn Wahb, the collections of Tabarani, the collections of Ibn Abi Dunya. Tremendous material. And what Motzky does is he actually goes and looks at all this material. He puts in the effort that Muslim scholars put in, at least to follow what they did. And I wrote a review of Yoinbol's book, and I feel bad because he's now dead, passed away. I don't want to speak ill of the dead. But I will say that what I said in the review is he complains about how, why did they think so atomistically about hadith? Why didn't they realize that if they put all these isnad trees together, they'll figure out that this material was forged? Well, where did you get these isnad trees? From their book. I mean, you used a book that is documenting these isnad trees. You're saying they're thinking atomistically and not holistically. But that's like saying, I mentioned this in the review, that's like saying that a society is unordered and disorganized by using their own phone book to say that. This is a list of everybody who lives in a country, alphabetically with address and phone number. How can you say that they're not? I mean, this is you're contradicting yourself. The very basis of your argument contradicts your argument. And why didn't they come to your conclusion that this stuff is made up? Because they don't have your assumptions, that it's all made up. They don't believe that just because there's not something before a common link that it was made up. because these come from assumptions that are specific to one culture, one civilization, one historical approach. Is that okay? All right, sorry. So when he looks at his articles and book chapters really focus on specific hadiths, and he especially used the Musannaf of Abdurrazzaq Sanani. So Abdurrazzaq Sanani died 217, I think, 211 or 217, I can't remember exactly. 211. And what is that in Miladi? Like 826. Okay. Yeah, okay. So he looked at this material, and what he says is, if you actually look at this huge breadth, you find that the common link is earlier than that someone like Yuan Bo would have thought. It's not a successor or one of the next generation. Sometimes the common links are companions. So you're pushing back a hadith to the late 600s, the time of people who knew the Prophet. And if the argument is that if there's a common link, then the hadith really existed at that time, what you're saying is it existed at the time of the companions of the Prophet, which is not that different than it's not far stretch of the imagination to say that it comes from the Prophet. You're basically getting back into the era of what Muslims would say. Now, he doesn't say this for all hadiths. He looks at specific ones. But what he says is, look, this material, some of it really seems to go back to the late 600s of the Common Era. Another thing he does is he looks at the transmissions of specific sources in Abdurrazzaq Sanani's Musannaf. He looks at Ibn Jurayj, who died 150. He looks at Ma'mar bin Rashid, who died 153 of the Common Era. He looks at the transmissions of al-Zuhri. And what he sees is that there seems to be real consistency in what Ibn Jurayj transmits, in what Ma'mar bin Rashid transmits. And that they will sometimes transmit material that they don't agree with, that contradicts their opinions on law. So if they're making this stuff up, why are they making stuff up that contradicts them? There's no reason for that. That they'll sometimes transmit things and say, I don't know what this means. It makes no sense to me. I don't know what this word means. I don't know what this movie means. Why would they make stuff up and then say, I don't know what it means? What he concludes is that people like Ibn Jurayj, Ma'mar bin Rashid, so we're talking about, the generation, 2 generations from the companions, but they seem to be reliably transmitting material, which gets you back to their sources in the early 100s Hijri, so the early 700s or late 600s. And this is, again, you're getting to the time of the companions. Not so different than what a Muslim would say. Now, a Muslim might say that this comes from the Prophet, but you're really pushing back the date of when this material can be established as existing historically from the early 700s to the late 600s, the time of the companions.
Jonathan, I have a question for you.
Yes.
By the way, I went to Chicago the year you left.
Oh, you went to Chicago to the university?
Yeah. Mohsen spoke about you to me a lot.
Mohsen?
Mohsen.
Yeah, Mohsen from Nadwi.
Mohsen, that's right. Yeah. Anyway, I actually did meet Fred Donna, took some classes with him and stuff like that. Quite nice. But nevertheless, my question for you is that something that I'm working on myself as well. But I want to put it as a question to you, just to see how you think about it. Certainly, the principles that we carry influence the judgment calls that we make. Right? So a capitalist judgment call will be very different from a communist judgment call.
Mm-hmm.
What principle, essentially, do you think the West has got right or wrong that's causing it to make the judgment calls that they're making in relation to the Hadith tradition? And I say this because I actually did point this out with Patricia in front of Fred Donna. and I made her apologize for this. Because she came and it was an interesting, although Islamic science was not, I'm more in philosophy. But I just want to say...
Well, what was the, hey, I'm curious, what was the thing you got her to apologize for?
It was a number of things. There was about 3 or 4 issues that me and Patricia sort of, she got so upset with me afterwards. She goes, how dare you do this to me in front of everyone? But, you know, nevertheless. And Fred Donner came up...
But what was the, I'm curious, what was the point?
No, I'll talk about that afterwards because that's very much related to the question that I've just posed to you.
Okay, I mean the question is what principles do you think that...
Dr. Brown,
yes.
Sorry. Can we leave that question for Shaykh Akram's here? I think it would be a good panel discussion and good answer. So if we can present that till later.
Fine with me.
Both of your views on it. Is that okay? So I'm sorry, you have to repeat the question.
The reason I asked this question...
Were you here last time for the last session at the beginning?
No, I just...
Well, I talked a lot about where the origins of principles are, and what the origins of principles of historical critical method are, and which of them are right or wrong is another issue we can talk about later. But the principles come out of, I mean, they come out of a, to be very brief, they come out of a rediscovery of Greco-Roman tradition, which is cynical, historically cyclical. There's not with this idea of the principle of analogy, societies are always functioning the same way. That is secular, in effect.
Okay,
it doesn't acknowledge it doesn't acknowledge.
Let him answer the question, and then we'll leave it until later on.
No, I'm not answering the question. I'm asking another question.
Well, you can only ask one question at a time. You want to know the principles, or do you not want to know the principles? Otherwise, I won't tell them because I already told them. Right? A secular vision. If you read Herodotus's histories, he died around 420 BC. He doesn't buy the interference of gods in reality. Sometimes he does, sometimes. But when he talks about the Trojan War, he doubts the whole premise of the Trojan War. People don't fight over women like this. No one's not going to go 10-year war because someone has some. Why didn't they return Helen? Who would fight a 10-year war? If some guy stole another man's wife, and just to give her back. This is nonsense. He says that Helen was never in Troy. So this is very interesting. This idea that doubts the involvement of the gods, doubts this what he feels is irrational way because people don't remember. People always behave the same way. Principle of analogy. It comes out of the humanist tradition of going back to early textual sources. That leads people like Desiderius Erasmus, died 1536, to, in his reconstruction of the original Greek Old Testament, to realize that certain verses, the verse that is the only explicit mentioning of the Trinity in the New Testament, that he realized this is not originally part of the New Testament. That leads them to the Renaissance sentiment that the world is getting better, that they are living in an era where new knowledge is being discovered. When you read someone like Louis Leroy died 1575, he talks about how we're making advances in knowledge that's never made before. They start the willingness to question established truths is absolutely essential from the 1500s until today. The fact that people, in the late 1700s, say that Homer didn't write the Iliad and the Odyssey. There was no person named Homer who wrote both these books. They're overturning a pillar of the Western literary canon. This confidence to overturn truths, established truths. The Protestant Reformation, which destroys control of interpretation of a text. The concomitant political liberalization in places like the Dutch Republic and eventually in England, in Holland in 1600 onward, in England after this English Civil War, and the recension of the censorship laws, or the lapsing of the censorship laws in England in the 1690s, creates freedom to think and express ideas. Discovery of the New World, discovering people who didn't fit into the biblical history of Noah and Adam, people who don't exist in the Aristotelian map of the world. It completely overturns what many of the assumptions that intellectuals in the European tradition had. And you can see this very clearly if you read books like the Essays of Montaigne, who died in 1592. It was a very good example. So these things all go into the basic principles of historical critical method.
Should we say 10 minutes and then back? Is Motsky done?
Yeah, I can just talk about these other ones next. That's fine. There's a very small point.
10 minutes, please.